Hello everyone, this is Kat. Welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. This will be the continuation of Deku and Death. This will be part 32, chapter 32, entitled, "And Together, Alone Had No More Power." The spotlight before, after he'd finished his speech and gotten that near-instant gratification, wasn't all too bad. Some part of him even wanted to experience something like it again. Now he really wished the universe would swallow him whole, never to be seen again. He kept telling himself it wasn't the same, but all that his mind could see were the predatory stares of his old middle school classmates as he was cornered into a wall, crowding around him, caging him in, watching him squirm in sick satisfaction. His lip quivered as the phantom scent of caramel and smoke had coiled in his head. His heart pounded in his chest, and the silence was suddenly replaced by snorts of distorted laughter. What can you even do? And as he wanted to give in to it all, he was startled by the break in the void. Do not let them get into your head. The smell retreated back into nothingness, the stares moved away, the laughter dispersed into silence, and when his eyes focused again, he half expected to see Gami standing before him, guarding him from all his troubles in the world. He wasn't, but at the same time he always was. It wasn't the same as before. He wouldn't let them get into his head. And he would never be alone. He turned back into the world. Midnight had finally continued to explain the details of this event, but honestly, Midoriya couldn't be bothered to really pay much attention. With the target on his head and the response from it, he had a real issue. With everyone against him, no one was going to want to team up with him. Of course, the fewer team members he had, the more of a disadvantage he would be at. But if he couldn't find anyone, well, it was starting to become a pressing issue of its own. With his obscene amount of points, the point value of the rest of his team became obsolete. He didn't need to consider that in his strategy, though now it was hopefully securing at least a couple of the names that raced into his head. "You've got 15 minutes, Midnight explained. "Time to form your teams." Of course, as that was said, he was immediately avoided like the plague. He pushed past the piercing in his chest. He would never be alone. "Midori." He turned around at his name. He really needed to stop getting lost in his own head like that. It really was starting to become problematic. Nonetheless, he found Uraraka facing him, a nervous smile on her face. "I was wondering if you wanted to team up." "Wait, really?" Probably not the best response, but to be fair, he was completely caught off guard. "You do know that everyone's going to be beelining for my 10 million points, right?" The brunette shrugged. "Yeah, but we'll win as long as we run away." Blunt, but yeah, that was his same thought process. "Besides," she continued, "teaming up with a friend just feels right." The compassion and kindness that radiated from her smile was almost blinding. Midori resisted the urge to look away in favor of having a shred of decency. But her optimism was infectious, and soon he found himself beaming as well, although it may have been related to how this was beginning to fall into perfect place. "Well, I actually wanted to team up with you too," he admitted, crossing off a mental checkbox. "And I've got a pretty good idea of who we should ask next." Uraraka pumped her fist. "I knew you would have a plan. So who?" He pointed his thumb over his shoulder, having known where his target was without even looking, which may or may not have been due to his distinctive nature of his attitude. "Let's go talk to Ida." Students parted for them as they walked, not wanting anything to do with the main target of everyone's eye. He noticed the shift in Uraraka's demeanor, watching her bubbliness fade away, and he too felt the isolation chip at his defenses, leaving some part of him wondering if it was always meant to end up like this. "I want to stay." He placed a hand on his friend's shoulder, and when she looked over to him in surprise, he smiled, small but true in every sense of the word. He had been fighting the world his whole life. What was one more time? They would never be alone. "Hey, Ida," he called out once they got close enough. "Can we talk privately for a minute?" He made his way over solemnly, and Midoriya couldn't help but notice his added coldness. "Midoriya, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Well, I was hoping you'd be interested in joining our team," he began, masking his worries with analytics. "Your speed would be essential for maneuverability, and it pairs well with Uraraka's ability to make us weightless. We'd have pretty defensive horse, so to speak, so our options for our rider could be more open." Ida didn't respond right away, leaving the other two to hope that it was merely because he was considering the idea. "I'd expect no less, Midori, but I'm sorry." He stepped away, leaving a sinking hole where he once stood. I refuse. Uraraka looked heartbroken, and he couldn't really blame her, but he didn't even need to ask why. It was obvious. Ever since the entrance exam, I've been losing to you. Ida pushed up his glasses, but made no effort for eye contact. It is precisely because you are a wonderful friend that I cannot follow you now. He'd shown himself to be a worthy contender, and that left no loyalty even between friends. But when Ida walked over to join Todoroki, his heart really sank. Bakugo and Todoroki aren't the only ones who see you as a rival, he declared. So I, too, challenge you. His gaze met the hardened stare of Todoroki, and he felt himself grow cold at the ice that emanated from it. Still, with thick acceptance, he looked on. I see. It was a defeat within itself, but 15 minutes left no time to mourn, so the two of them continued on. There were still some options left in his head. Just because his main plan had fallen through didn't mean he had all hope lost yet. Don't worry. He wasn't sure if he was consoling Uraraka or himself. I've got another idea. I'm almost certain that she placed high enough to qualify. Midori! He didn't have a chance to react as the person he was looking for bombarded him. Team up with me, Mr. First Place, Hatsume commanded, nearly shaking him by the shoulders. Sure, he agreed right away, if only to stop her from dizzying him. We were actually looking for you anyways. That got her to pause. Really? At this point she calmed down enough to notice Uraraka, who had backed away slightly to avoid the roughhousing herself. The two girls shared a slight and awkward wave as things started to de-escalate. Well, yeah, Midoriya broke the ice. I was hoping that you had some stuff to help with our lack of mobility. Hatsume scoffed and then proceeded to reveal only a handful of her full arsenal. Trust me, anything that you could possibly think of needing, I've got. The teen smiled as his confidence had returned. He looked over to Uraraka just to make sure she agreed with the arrangements before extending out a hand professionally. Deal? Her entrepreneur attitude had showed as she clasped hands with him enthusiastically. Deal. Midori let out a breath that he didn't realize he was holding. Okay, this was good. Sure, losing Ida had definitely been a blow to the half-cooked strategy he had in his head, but he trusted Hatsume. If wearing her gloves meant anything, he was sure that her inventions would provide the mobility they needed to be defensive. So, Uraraka looked up at the clock nervously. Who's next? But he'd already jumped onto that train of thought, moving faster than his body could keep up with, although the ticking timer did add to his adrenaline. I'll be right back. He left no chance to argue as he took off, weaving past stray bodies and harsh looks as he searched for someone in particular. Their formation was pretty mobile already, but even with Uraraka and Hatsume, they lack a certain physical strength. If Midori was to be part of the horse, then he'd have absolutely no shot at being able to use his own abilities. Essentially, being nothing more than dead weight. If they had managed to recruit Ida, then they wouldn't have been having too big of an issue, since they likely wouldn't have had to worry about confrontation at all, but especially with Ida being on another team, a team that's gunning for him, he would need every advantage that he could offer. He would have to be the rider, which left the front of their horse bare and unprotected. A critical oversight to most, but he had a plan that included someone very crucial, someone who, hopefully, wouldn't be discouraged by frivolous rivalries, nothing against Ida. Midori! Midori! That was becoming a trend of late. Something was curled around him, and for a second he thought it was Kami, only to catch black wisps and, assuming it was his robe, but upon meeting the sharp yellow eyes he came to another conclusion. It was almost as if fate wanted him to believe in it, seeing how everything decided to fall into place just now. Ah, hey, Dark Shadow. He smiled at the bird, looking around to see where his shadow had stretched. Where's Tokiyami? Dark Shadow made a half-hearted gesture over his shoulder, which did nothing to help Midori in the slightest, before continuing to beam at his side. Thankfully, he didn't have to wait long, considering he would know personally. Whenever his partner ran off, he was certainly close behind. Dark Shadow, what have we talked about? Tokiyami appeared, trying to look calm but clearly a little rattled. You can't be doing this, especially now when people are watching. The bird had rolled his eyes, but reluctantly returned to Tokiyami's side. Midori watched his classmate sigh, making the effort to compose himself before locking eye contact. I apologize for the hassle, Midori, though it seems as if this may be a regular occurrence. He nudged his partner accusingly. Midoriya just laughed, understanding the hassle all too well. It's no problem, really. Kind of convenient, even, since I was looking for you. Tokiyami cocked his head, while Dark Shadow seemed to grow excited. Oh? Would you be interested in joining our team? Yes! Dark Shadow interrupted before he could even finish, startling Midoriya into silence and Tokiyami into a slight disappointment. The bird looked between the two humans innocently, and the teen had to hold in his laughter at the situation to spare Tokiyami any more shame that he could be feeling. Why? Tokiyami paused to give the shadow a stern look, tempting him to interrupt him again. Why do you wish for us to join? He channeled a little bit of Hatsume, hoping his persuasion skills would be up to par. Uraraka and Hatsume both provide a sufficient amount of maneuverability on their own, but as a team we lack physical strength. If you and Dark Shadow were to be our front of the horse, I could have my hands free as the rider, and we'd only have to worry about playing defense in case of a team getting too close. So your plan is to run? He clarified, a finger under his beak. Well, when you put it that way, it's not all that dignified, Midori admitted, scratching at his neck. But it doesn't make a lot of sense to play offensively and put ourselves at risk when we already have a win condition. Tokiyami nodded, seeming to agree with his thought. Very well, we would be honored to join you. Yes! Dark Shadow cheered. We won't let you down. Midoriya felt like he could finally breathe. He beckoned the two to follow him back to where the others were waiting, hoping that Hatsume hadn't driven Uraraka to insanity just yet. Thankfully, both girls were fine, not that he was truly worried. He huddled them into a close circle, wanting to keep their plans a secret, not that anyone wanted to get close enough to listen anyways. All right, here's the plan. Your 15 minutes are up, Midnight announced. Time to get started. The four of them looked up, along with everyone else, realizing there was no more time to stall. Let's get into formation. Tokiyami beckoned them as a feeling of finality started to wash over them. But not even he could hide his nervousness. How could anyone when it was obvious what awaited them? He lowered his back, Dark Shadow helping to stabilize him as he extended his arms behind. Uraraka met him on his right, clasping a hand with one of Tokiyami's and placing the other on his shoulder. Hatsume had finalized the inventions of hers that were attached to them before copying Uraraka on Tokiyami's other side. Finally, Midori approached, wondering how he should even attempt to climb on top of them, when Uraraka moved one of her hands and went to touch him on the shoulder. Let me make you weightless, she told him. Dark Shadow, can you give me a hand? Midori was lifted off of the ground by his armpits, the move itself so reminiscent of his mentor he had to remind himself he asked the ghost to simply watch. But alas, the dark hands that picked him up and placed him atop of his friends were not Gami's. He settled into position, worrying if he was too heavy for the three of them, only to remember that he was weightless. He secured the jetpack on his back for what had to be the third time, before tightening the 10-million-point headband around his forehead. He toyed with the idea in his head, before finally deciding to remove one of his gloves and stuff it away in his pocket. He was nearly sure that he wouldn't have to use DT, but that small inkling of uncertainty convinced him to be ready just in case. The speakers blared to life. Here comes the starting signal. And then all eyes returned. Leagues, oceans of eyes, staring them down, eyeing them like starving wolves. The world was out for blood, their blood, his blood. Ding. Uraraka, he called out. Ready when you are. In the past, before days like today, he would give in to the world and drag his lifeless body back home. He would have been nothing more than a corpse, mutilated chew toy for them to play with and throw away. And in the past, he wouldn't have bothered to fight it, letting them drain him away in hopes that they'd finally leave him be, but he knew they never would. Ding. Hatsume? Let's show them what we've got. But that was just the past. That was when he felt truly alone, and not even the soft comforts from his mentor could convince his poor heart otherwise. But after UA, after making real friends, after the USJ, he was able to see the truth of his ambitions. No matter where he went in his life, who he met, who he lost, he would never be alone. And no matter the situation, however desperate, however hopeless, however excruciating, he would never leave a soul alone. He would be there, no matter what, just as all the people in his life had been for him. Ding. Tokiyami, Dark Shadow? Yeah, let's crush them. His whole life, the world had been trying to abandon him and make sure that he was abandoned by the world. And for a while he was ashamed to admit that it worked, but despite the efforts of fate, there were people that chose to fight for him, to fight to remain at his side, even if they didn't realize it. And for that he would be forever grateful. For that he would dedicate his life to protecting the people who felt like they were alone as well. Groups turned to face them, ready to rip their throats out, but he would fight to the very brink of his life and beyond because he would never do this alone. Let's do this. Start! Right off the bat, two groups had raced towards them. One he recognized right away, being composed of some of his classmates. The other he didn't, meaning it was likely Class B kids. The unknown had left him wary. He had no idea what their quirks were, giving them an element of surprise. The fate of those pursued. Leave it to Tokiyami never to forget the theatrics. Make your choice, Midori. Fate, huh? Well, he already knew how he felt about fate. It could kiss his... Run away, he'd commanded his team, nearly losing his focus. We stay on the defensive. But before they could act, Midori felt his horse shift off balance. He looked down, as did the rest of the team, only to find that they were sinking to the ground at an alarming rate as well. It had to be a Class B quirk. Problematic indeed. Uraraka, can we take off? The boots, they need a second, she cried as she looked down at them. Shit, they didn't have a second with the speed the teams were actually closing in on. Time to make one then. He summoned his scythe with wild fervor, which definitely startled some of the members of the approaching teams. The thought of looking scary crossed into his head that he certainly didn't resemble a hero with the terrifying powers he had. You don't belong as a hero, especially not with a dangerous quirk like that. But with everyone beside him, he would become one anyway. He would bring good to the world with his powers because he would never be alone. Have a taste of your own medicine, he hollered as he slammed the tip of his blade into the shrinking amount of space between them. The ground exploded into cracks and shards, and much like what happened at the USJ, it became almost completely unnavigable. Both teams were actually forced to stop in their haste of a favor of saving their balance and their riders from falling off. Ready! Uraraka shouted. Midori grabbed the small activation button by the side of his chest and then looked behind him. Both of you, turn away! He pressed the button, and the jetpack had been attached to his back. It flared to life, shooting them out of the quicksand and far into the sky. They were easily able to maintain their airtime thanks to Uraraka having everyone been made weightless except for herself. Because of that, he was almost able to breathe for the first time since they had started. But he couldn't, not after seeing the glint in the corner of his eye. Dark Shadow, on your left! The bird zoomed past him and swiped the glint out of the sky with a ferocious screech, of which happened to be Jiro's earjacks. Well done, Dark Shadow, Tokiyami praised. Be sure to cover our blind spots. He squawked, Gotcha! Slowly, however, their time in the air had diminished, leading Midoriya to look for a clearing where they could hopefully land without any problems. There, he directed with a point of his finger, readying himself. Let's land! They descended swiftly to avoid being ambushed, and Uraraka steadied them with a masterful control of her magnetic landing boots that Hatsume equipped her with. How do you like my babies? The inventor asked excitedly about their performance. And Midoriya, finally feeling the rush of adrenaline and pure excitement that was working with a great team, it was more not being alone as well. He laughed. They're making us totally mobile. Your babies are great, Hatsume. But there was no more time to celebrate as the Class B team from earlier and another team that seemed to only consist of shoji approached from either side. We need to get moving, he yelled to his team. I can't, Uraraka exclaimed, tugging at her foot. I'm stuck. He looked down and was greeted with the sight of a sticky purple ball holding one of the boots to the ground. Shit, Minetta, but where? He dodged the subsequent purple ball by instinct alone, barely missing it as it zoomed past his face, coming from the direction that Shoji was raising from. Cover me from the side and I'll free us, he yelled to Tokiyami, summoning his weapon. Dark Shadow roared, flared himself to create a barrier between them and the Class B team. Midori wasted no time in cutting Uraraka free, managing his DT so that the purple ball was the only thing decayed upon contact with his blade, and not the boot. But as he attempted to return to a more stable position, he was forced to dodge wildly as a tongue had lunged right for his head. Thankfully, it flew right over him and instead smacked the head of a Class B team's rider. "We're free! Lift off!" he announced as Uraraka and Hatsume had both turned away again. Then he slammed the button again and they burst into the air, both teams previously attacking them now focused on each other instead, leaving Midoriya to heave a sigh of relief. Shoji was hiding Mineta and Sue under his arms, the teen informed as they soared safely through the air. "We have to expect sneaky things like that, so keep your eyes open." The team nodded, but then they were rudely and yet quite poetically interrupted by a bang of an explosion. "Getting pretty full of yourself, huh, you bastard?" He didn't even have to look to know who it was, but his eyes caught him anyway. Shit. His heart sparked with nothing but primal fear, filled with the overwhelming desire to run away. His body summoned his scythe out of pure instinct as Bakugo barreled towards him with a psychotic grin, hand outstretched to blast away his entire head along with the headband, but he wasn't going to cut a classmate, another human, in half. He didn't know what he could do, and he was sent spiraling back to his middle school days. He hesitated, leaving him wide open and unprotected as Bakugo had swiped at his head without restraint. He would have been nothing more than a smear against the ground after being shot out of the sky, if it weren't for Dark Shadow, that was. The bird had let out an ear-piercing screech as Bakugo's fury-powered explosion cut into him. It would have been heartless not to wince. The absolute agony in the voice was obvious, but since Dark Shadow shielded Midori completely from the attack, the 10-million-point headband remained, and Midori remained intact himself. "Dark Shadow, move!" he cried out, noticing Bakugo stalling in the air much like he did in the earlier race. The shadow obeyed, but regardless if Bakugo lagged from the stalling or from his failed attack, he took advantage and swung the blunt edge of his scythe into him. He knocked the explosive aggressor violently out of the sky, not caring to see where he fell, as they were also starting to descend. They landed peacefully without any encounters, and Midori took it as a blessing to get his heart rate down. "Midori?" Even in a smaller state, Dark Shadow found the energy to curl beside him. "You okay?" And then he realized how much he'd also almost cost the team. His 1-second lapse in thought had nearly led to their entire plan falling apart. His 1-second lapse in thought had led Dark Shadow to having to take the full brunt of Bakugo's explosion to protect him and their points. He couldn't afford to make that kind of mistake again, because he wasn't alone. "I'm fine. I'm sorry." He made sure that his uncovered hand wasn't touching anything as he took a few quick breaths. "Let's focus. If we can keep this up." Another team approached them slowly and deliberately, making everyone tense, and upon locking eyes with the sight of so familiar and yet so foreignly cold, Midori resisted shaking from the chill down his spine. "We're here for you." He really shook at those words, but channeled himself out of desperation. His team must have sensed his hidden iron resolve, because they too stiffened in preparation, ready for a fight. Dark Shadow swelled to an enormous size, wrapping his newfound length around the entire team like a cobra waiting to strike. He stared hard into Todoroki's eyes, but despite everything he found nothing. So, this was really how it was going to go. "They're really gunning for you, Midori," Tokiyami hissed, unable to push his words any further into the thick air. "I know, but we have to really get away." He whispered it back, his eyes darting from each side in his peripherals. "We've got multiple teams closing in on us from all angles." And sure enough, there had to be at least 4 different teams heading for the 2 of theirs. Todoroki had to have seen it too. He knew that he was extremely observant, so why was he so locked into this stalemate unless... He looked at the other members of his team. Ida was obvious, being out front and in plain sight. Kaminari on the left. Yaoyorozu on the right. "We need to get out of here, now!" he yelled to his horses, looking around and trying to get a break somewhere. "Just move!" Tokiyami seemed to understand, his eyes widening in realization. "Go!" The girls struggled to catch up to their pace, but nonetheless they scrambled to create some distance. There wasn't much of anywhere to go, however, with everyone else closing in. "Forward, Ida," Todoroki commanded, and the tone alone made their hearts skip a beat. "Let's prepare for takeoff," Hatsume called, sensing the limited space. But that seemed to be the magic word for Todoroki as he blazed into stern action. "Yaoyorozu, Kaminari, now." An insulator sheet had popped from Yaoyorozu's back. "Dark Shadow, shield us." Tokiyami shouted, and his partner had whipped into action just in time, protecting them all from Kaminari's massive shock in every direction. The haunting scream that came from the bird stained Midoriya's heart completely, but he could only watch as he took the full force of yet another light-based attack. From what Tokiyami had told them about Dark Shadow's nature before the cavalry battle, and from what he had pieced together before, this was nothing but excruciatingly painful in a way that only Dark Shadow could feel. As the brightness had dimmed down, he watched ice now spread along the ground, arriving at some of the closer groups first and freezing them to the earth. Thankfully, because of the distance they'd managed to put between them and their lack of immobilization due to Dark Shadow, Midoriya had more than enough reflexes to summon his scythe and stop the ice that chased them for one large grand swing, leaving nothing but a clean cut in the earth and residual flakes of decay. But he could do nothing to stop the ice that was everywhere else, and suddenly they were enclosed in a sharded area. It was an arena that was only accessible to its creator and the lucky fools who'd managed to escape its initial frost. "We need to fly," Uraraka yelled, registering how caged in they truly were. And Midori agreed with her. Their jetpack, however... "The jetpack is fried from Kaminari's electricity," he cursed out, realizing that not all the volts had been blocked like he thought. "But I can decay the ice if we get close enough." That clearly wasn't in Todoroki's game plan. "Close in." Dark Shadow had shot out to try and attack them, throwing his lashing body in a wild tackle, but Yaoyorozu created a metallic barrier that proved to be too much for his weakened state, causing him to retreat. He succeeded in stopping the other team from their charge, however, as they paused in hesitancy. But when the little bird had returned with a sniffle instead of his usual vibrancy, Midoriya grew more worried. "Tokiyami," he hissed under his breath, to keep his thoughts from being overheard. "How's Dark Shadow doing?" The other allowed his partner to retreat further into him as he tried to gain back his fading strength. "He's certainly more docile than usual, but he should be back up to almost full daytime strength in about a minute or two." "Would they know?" He directed his head towards Todoroki's team, who still kept their distance. Tokiyami shook his head. "Probably not. I only ever told Koda about my weakness when we were warped together at the USJ, and he doesn't talk very much." "Good. We're at the advantage, then." He then directed himself toward his whole team, still in whispers. "Let's stay on the defensive. Focus on evasive maneuvers." The team moved as one cohesive unit, starting a slow tread around the enclosed arena. Anytime Todoroki's team would make a move toward them, they'd move the same space away, always maintaining a sufficient amount of distance. "I can be our offense if necessary, but they won't want to approach without a clear shot if Midori was rambling his thoughts to his team as quickly as they came, so he almost didn't catch himself using Todoroki's given name in public. Luckily he did, but that didn't erase the sting in his chest when he corrected himself. "If Todoroki tries to use his ice, it won't work." And sure enough, almost as if fate wanted to test his words, Todoroki touched an icy metal pole to the ground, sending a wave of ice at them. He wasted no time repeating what he'd done before, and with a quick swipe of his blade, the frost was stopped in its tracks, reduced to nothing but dust. The pole that he was using to conduct his quirk had snapped from the cold, and Yaoyorozu rushed to make him another. "Keep to his left if you can." It felt dirty to exploit a weakness that felt so personal, one that only really was known about because of their close relationship, but his rationale had convinced him it was fair game because he had his team to support, because he wasn't alone. "He won't use that side, and he won't be able to use this ice anymore unless he wants to risk hurting Ida." And so, for 5 tense minutes, the two teams had circled each other, one unable to really attack and the other intending to just keep it that way. Dark Shadow had recovered and was now assisting in maintaining distance, pushing the others into retreating if they tried to close that gap. They were so close. There couldn't be more than a minute left. Just a little longer, a little further, and they could officially say that they'd done it. But it truly wouldn't be that easy. It never was. In an instant, Todoroki's team had zoomed for them, carried by thick plumes of engine exhaust. Midori raised his hand to summon his scythe, but he wasn't fast enough to beat out Ida's sudden burst of speed. His heart stopped as he felt the headband being ripped from him. Todoroki's team had skidded to a stop right at the edge of the boundaries, but they didn't seem to be moving anymore. Heavy smoke leaked from Ida's exhaust, filling the air with smog and darkness, and yet he could see the glint of satisfaction even behind the glasses. "They got it! Change of plans!" He was flooded with adrenaline, the worst kind, the anxiety-inducing kind, the kind that made him sick to his stomach. "Charge them!" "What about Kaminari?" Tokiyami had yelled. "We can't risk another lightning attack." There's not enough time to scavenge for points. There was no way that they could raise their score from absolute zero in the seconds that were remaining. This is our only option. From behind, Uraraka and Hatsume had pushed forward, startling Tokiyami into movement. They began shakily, but everyone realized their shared burn of desperation. They'd done so well leading up to now, but that didn't matter anymore. This was now the only part that mattered, so they had to give it their all. "We're getting it back, Midori," Uraraka bellowed, shifting from desperation to determination. "No doubt." Hatsume cheered along with her, pushing her poor stamina to its limits with a smile. Tokiyami bared his teeth like a savage animal, calling out to Dark Shadow, who had magnified himself as much as he could despite the high noon sun. That's right, he wasn't doing this alone. He wasn't doing this just for himself. He had people that he relied on since they'd started, and now those people were relying on him. He'd put his faith into them when he'd asked them to join him in this fight, and now they were doing the same, placing their faith in him in the last home stretch. His heart was filled with hope, more hope than he could even muster, and that was because he was carrying all their hopes with him too. He wouldn't fail now because he would never be alone. He locked eyes with Todoroki. The distance between it was being nothing more than an inch now. His normally passive green eyes burned with hopes and dreams greater than himself, burned with such vivacity that it was unnatural. He raised his uncovered hand, feeling blood, adrenaline, and power in his fingertips, and he reached out. Todoroki raised his own arm to try and defend himself, unable to think in the sheer pressure of the air. All he could do was react on instinct, as his left side had burst into flames that licked everything around them. There was no stopping now. Midori's veins were brimming with unreleased energy. It had nowhere else to go but to escape. His mind shuddered at the sight of fire. The scar that he'd nearly moved on from was itching on his chest. All he wanted to do was to stop before he hurt someone or someone hurt him, but he couldn't hesitate now, or he'd cost his team everything. It was fine. This was fine. He wouldn't hit him. He wouldn't hurt him. His hand flew toward the flames, nearly faltering when the heat smothered his skin. He just had to. His fingertips buzzed painfully. The fire burned terrifyingly. He wasn't alone, though. His hand swiped across the air in front of Todoroki, and the immediate area resonated with a loud pop. Todoroki's flaming arm was blown to the side, his fire extinguished instantly. Midori was blown back slightly, but kept his balance out of steely resolve, and upon the break in Todoroki's ironclad defenses, he reached for the top headband around his neck, thinking that was where he would have placed the 10 million when he had put it on. The rip of the headband was arguably louder than the small explosion that he'd created just before. "I got it!" he announced to his team as they came to a screeching halt, taking deep breaths to recover from their final push. He wasn't planning on trying to use the explosions he discovered that he could emit from his hands at the USJ. He deemed them too risky to afford using against someone for now, considering that he didn't spend much time really fine-tuning the mechanics, but here it had come out instinctually like it had against Shigaraki, manifesting out of pure desperation. He was lucky that he didn't hurt Todoroki by accident, but his mind excused it away since they had gotten back the 10 million point headband in return. He opened up his tightly closed fist, and his heart sank straight to the pits of his stomach when the number 70 stared back at him. He grabbed the wrong one. "No!" he cried in despair. "It's the wrong one!" Damn it! Damn it all straight to the underworld. Todoroki must have switched around the order of the headbands as he put them on. He looked up at the scoreboard. 70 points alone wasn't enough to make the top 4. They weren't going to make it like this. "Time's almost up. Let's count down." Present Mike blared over the speakers. 10. "We have to go back," Midoriya commanded frantically. "Go!" His team sputtered into movement, racing back to Todoroki. 9. He could hear some of the icy arena dissolve away out of the corner of his eye. 8. A horse consisting of Kirishima, Sero, and Ashido had charged through the newfound hole, though he couldn't see the rider. 7. Bakugo flew over the icy wall, propulsed by his fiery explosions, that same psychotic grin on his face. 6. Yaoyorozu pulled another insulator sheet over her team. 5. Dark Shadow threw himself in the way of a second shock from Kaminari, protecting the team from being stunned. Bakugo simply dodged the electricity midair with a controlled blast. 4. Bakugo scrambled, trying to use his airtime to decipher who currently had the 10 million. 3. Midori reached out, stretching his fingers as far as he possibly could, but it wasn't enough. He needed to get closer. 2. Todoroki leaned away instinctively, but with Ida's stalling, there was really nowhere he could go. 1. Just a little further. Time's up. He swiped, but his hand met nothing but air. He heard Bakugo crash into the ground, but all he could feel was his hopes crashing from the inside. What a roller coaster! Present Mike had echoed the feelings of the audience, who sat on the edge of their seats. Let's see the top 4 teams. His horse started to unwind themselves, and Midori realized he was nearly crashing to the ground himself, too demoralized to really move. He dropped to his feet, finally being able to feel the earth against him, but it didn't matter. He slipped his glove back on and was finally being able to feel its comforting enclosure, but it didn't matter. He'd failed. In first, Team Todoroki. He didn't even register. Hatsume unstrapped the jetpack from his back, turning to his team dejectedly. I'm sorry. If he had failed himself, sure, it would have been sour, but what really wrapped him in guilt was that he wasn't alone. He failed all of them, too. In second, Team Bakugo. But the girls didn't seem as disappointed as he expected them to be after his performance. Actually, they smiled eagerly at him, excitedly pointing behind them at Tokiyami. Todoroki was clearly shaken by your first attack, he explained. I did my best to nab the 10 million, but I came up short too. In third, Team Shinso. But because you dropped his guard. Dark Shadow had swirled out from behind his partner, looking a little worse for wear, but otherwise grinning widely. In his proud grin, a headband had hung. Dark Shadow was able to grab the one that was on his head. On it, Midori could make out the number 615. His jaw dropped in realization. Tokiyami couldn't help but smile, just like everyone else. Midori, you did not fail. I did not fail. We succeeded as a team, together. And in fourth, Team Midoriya. He wasn't alone, so he couldn't have failed alone. They were a team, a cohesive unit. If one person struggled, the rest of the team were there to pick them back up and push forward. They either failed together or succeeded together. There was no isolation for either. These 4 teams will proceed to the final event. And that sure as hell didn't sound like failing. Uraraka tackled him into a hug. Smiling and beaming and laughing, Hatsume joined the group hug as well, though not without her jetpack in the other arm. Dark Shadow found the strength to expand his form, curling around them happily, and while Tokiyami stayed on the outside, his ecstatic expression said it all. They had done it. They had done it. And for one of the rare moments in his life, Midoriya just laughed gleefully, hard and pure. He laughed and embraced his team tightly, joy swelling his poor heart 3 sizes larger. He would never be alone. We'll proceed to the afternoon portion of the 1-hour lunch break as well. A gate was leading to the arena exit had opened up. See you then. After they had broken apart from the embrace and people drifted off to find their friends for lunch, Midori didn't wait to find his. He slinked off through the crowds, finding an empty hallway to escape sight, making his way away from the crowded cafeteria. He'd eat lunch later, but now he was far more preoccupied with something else, someone else, and he was sure that he wouldn't find him in the lunchroom. Hey, where are you? He whispered under his breath at every crossroad before hurrying down a new hallway to cover some more ground. Damn it, finding a ghost should not be this difficult. I swear, if you're doing this on purpose... But he didn't even get to really finish his threat, as he was tackled off his feet and then picked up off of them by a cold, undead touch and spun around wildly. You were incredible. There exists an insufficient amount of words to describe the overwhelming rush in my soul. Whoa, whoa, Midoriya chuckled, trying to right his vision after being spun around dizzily. I can tell this is way more solid than you usually get. The ghost set him back down with a snap, much too animated to command his movement finally. But he still kept his bony hands wrapped under the boy's sides, unable to bring himself to part contact. Of course, I know how talented and capable you are, but even I was unprepared for such a performance. You truly left an astonishing impression on the audience, did you know? The teen blinked. Like, a good impression? Gami removed one of his hands to wave off to the side. There will always be those who fear power, so easily stereotyped, but I wish you had been there with me. It was as if everywhere I went someone was speaking of your skills. The spirit let go of him completely, becoming too lively to remain still enough to hold him. Your agility, your ingenuity, your ability to react quickly to changing situations, you certainly caught the eyes of the crowd. His never-ending stream of praise had Midoriya rooted to his spot in bashful pride. Most were very obviously expecting a great performance from Todoroki, being the son of the number 2 hero, but Bakugo as well, seeing as he was made infamous after that sludge villain incident. So for you to show them up completely, you've made quite the stir. He smiled sheepishly. I wouldn't say I showed them up. But he wasn't able to finish as Gami slapped his hands right back down on his successor's shoulders, very harshly, holding him in a death grip. However, if you continue with your blatant recklessness for your own safety, so paradise help me, I will refuse to leave your side ever again. Midoriya laughed his breathy, awkward laugh. I know, I'm sorry. I just got so caught up in the action and... Gami gave him a disapproving look from under his hood. He sighed in defeat. I'll do my best. He held up his hand, knowing his mentor was going to interrupt him again. And I'll always have you to make sure that I don't do anything dumb and reckless, just in case it so happens to slip my mind. That made the ghost smile, not that anyone could really tell. Besides that, in all honesty, I am so proud of you. I'm proud to have known you for every piece of who you are. It was Gami's turn to be caught off guard as the teen just suddenly embraced him in a bone-crushing hug. Midoriya held him close against the tattered yet comforting robes that had swaddled him in the years before and even still now. There might have been times in the past where he felt alone despite everything, but each one of those instances he had been held close in his mentor's cloak until he no longer did. He'd never really been alone, and he never would be alone. What a truly peaceful thought. They separated, and Gami gave his hair a quick ruffle. All right, let's get you some lunch. You need it for whatever the next event may be. I finally found you. The duo spun around towards the entrance of whatever hallway they had found themselves in, both startled and desperately hoping they hadn't been observed. Todoroki stood coldly at the end, hands stuffed crudely in his pockets, eyes empty and dead. Midoriya never got any more prepared for it. Shouto, he stuttered, trying to collect himself. I don't... He was interrupted, of which was happening a lot as of late. We need to talk. Todoroki had led him to the hallway outside of the prep room, the entire time without uttering a single sound. They made a careful effort to avoid being seen by anyone. Needless to say, questions would definitely make things more complicated than it needed to be, not to say that things weren't convoluted already. Midoriya stood stiff at one side of the hallway, unable to relax under the other's harsh gaze, even with his mentor beside him. Todoroki, however, relaxed himself just fine, leaning against the other side with his hands still in his pockets. They only stared at each other in a tense silence. Midoriya swore his heart was thumping loud enough to echo out of his chest cavity. His lungs choked on the thick, suffocating air as he gripped the fabric of his sweatpants in his fists in a desperate attempt to calm himself. You wanted to talk? He finally started, afraid that if he didn't he'd be waiting here forever. I still need to grab lunch. But Todoroki said nothing, instead narrowing his eyes further. The frozen glare that came from him shook Midoriya to its core and nearly made him back into the wall to escape it. He swallowed thickly, tasting the bile that threatened to creep up his throat. He thought that he knew what intimidation was before, but while Bakugo's was hot and explosive, Todoroki's was much colder and more unforgiving. You overwhelmed me. His voice cut through the air and straight into his chest. You made me break my pledge to never use my left side. I refuse to use my bastard of a father's quirk. I'll become a hero without it. He didn't register in the moment, but Todoroki had used his fire against him in the cavalry battle, in what seemed to be sheer desperation, but he hadn't tried to get him to use his fire on purpose. Was he angry because he exploited that pledge when telling his own team to stay to Todoroki's left? It seemed like the best option at the time, but maybe it was more insensitive than he first realized. If this is about staying to your left during the cavalry battle, then I'm sorry. Shut up, he commanded, and Midoriya paled instantly from the hostility, his mouth going dry. Gami growled, fed up with the other's blatant disrespect as of late, but Just as he was about to intervene, he paused. He watched as Todoroki seemed to realize what he said, and then grow stunned by his own words, almost like he hadn't intended to say them. His face was washed over with shock and hidden disgust, breaking the layer of coldness that masked it before. As Todoroki seemed to compose himself and his train of thought, Gami narrowed his own eyes, but went against his anger in favor of his gut, which had never lied to him before. I despise my father's fire. I hate everything he stands for. He continued like the outburst from before simply never happened. I swore to him and to myself that I would rise to the top without his rotten power, but you made me break that promise so easily. Midoriya, however, hadn't recovered as nicely, struggling to keep his heart rate from exploding. He felt trapped, despite the clear exit on either end, trapped within Todoroki's unrelenting gaze. He didn't want to abandon him. He'd promised to himself before that he wouldn't give up on the friendship they'd established, but it took all that he had not to give into this primal and cowardly instinct of just running away. You understand how it feels to be trapped by blood. You're probably the only person who really would. You know how it feels to hate your blood with every fiber of your being, to wish to be purged of everything that it connects you to. It is people like him. He spat out in a sudden bitterness after seemingly calming down from before. He stopped to think, did he really hate his blood? Now that he was older, it was painfully obvious to him that his parents weren't good people, despite the light his younger years and self tried to put in them. But did he hate them? Sure, he was afraid of them. With the way the scar on his chest itched every so often, or the way the smell of alcohol burned his nose, it was fair to say that he still was. He wasn't denying that he spent many nights crying under the moonlight, wondering what he'd done wrong, but he didn't find himself actively hating his parents for what he went through, nor did he find himself wanting to be disconnected from his blood. He just wished things could have turned out differently. Gami watched Todoroki almost fight himself through his words, switching like Jekyll and Hyde, and every second longer it went on, it unnerved the ghost exponentially as well. His gut was screaming something wasn't right, and whatever it was, it set off every red flag that he'd collected over centuries. You would understand me better than anyone else possibly could, so I don't understand why I feel that same kind of anger towards you. Midoriya's eyes widened in disbelief as his skin grew paler than the ground beneath him. His heart stopped, and he could feel his muscles cramping on it, trying to get it to restart. I don't understand. As of recently, every time I see you, I lose my rationality. Todoroki pressed forward, interrupting him without a second thought, and while it spooked Midoriya back into silence, Gami noticed something more. The boy was speaking with urgency, like he wanted to get all his thoughts out of his head before he lost them. This uncontrollable urge of violence arises, directing me to hurt you, to make you suffer. Even now, I feel nothing but contempt for you. What? What was he supposed to say to that? What was he supposed to say when the person he'd shared so much of himself with, his dreams, his fears, his hopes, admitted to wanting his torment? What was he supposed to say to anyone who admitted to wanting to add to his pain? Todoroki threaded a hand through the white half of his hair, combing his fingers through over and over again as both his movements and his words became more sporadic. But you've done nothing to me. In fact, you've been the most supportive person I've had in my life. The hand in his hair suddenly locked up, pulling painfully tight as he pressed his fingers into the very meat of his skull. And yet, I'm being flooded with hatred and loathing for you, none of which feels like my own. The conversation strayed away from definition, turning into a one-sided window of Gami and Midoriya watching Todoroki almost argue with himself. He grew frazzled as his mind clearly searched for reasoning behind the chaos, and Midoriya wanted so desperately to reach out and ground him because, while he was unsettled by the complete break in character, he knew how confusing and downright terrifying it was to spiral. When he spiraled deep into himself, it felt like he was suffocating within his own mind, like the very thoughts that he was trying to escape from filled his lungs instead of air. He stepped forward, holding a hand out to his friend, prepared to take what Gami had so willingly given to him and extend it forward, but was startled back as Todoroki violently lurched forward. I don't understand. I feel like I'm losing control of myself, and it scares me beyond belief. And for the first time today, that stone-cold glass in his eyes was broken, revealing the scared boy locked beneath, the fear and desperation of a lost child, because that's all they were. He shook violently, grasping his hair in one hand, wrapping the other around his sides in a last-ditch effort to keep himself together. My hatred for my father is justified, but to feel that way towards you unfounded, my mind is desperately trying to excuse it away, that you deserve this hate because you pried your way into my life, or that you somehow connected to All Might, and I've sworn to crush him, but none of it feels true because it isn't. His chest heaved as he finally came down from his escalating high, settling into a depressive drain as he collapsed against the wall. He stared down at his hands, which were still trembling despite the total crumble of himself. He stared down into them hard, but alas, they didn't hold the answers that he was desperately looking for. I actually wanted to talk to you, to berate you about making me break my pledge, even though it was no fault of yours. He clenched his fists together shamefully, angry at himself after his mouth finally admitted to the truth of his head. When I was searching for you while filled with that urge of violence that commanded me to leave you hurt. Even now, it's as if something has wrapped itself within my head and refuses to leave me be. And then he sighed, dropping his hands back into his pockets. His head fell on his neck. Looking down at the floor, the gloss in his eyes returned, but rather than laced with cold harshness, it simply seemed void of life. I don't know why I'm even telling you this. Maybe, as I said it out loud, I hoped that it would make sense to me, but now I just feel like I've lost myself completely. They stood in silence once more as the weight of all the words that were said dropped from the thick air and flooded to the floor. But Midoriya didn't know what to say, too stunned to do anything but attempt to process the bombshell that had been dropped before, and maybe that was his mistake, because Todoroki pushed himself dejectedly off the wall. I don't know what I am thinking. Sorry for wasting your time. But as the other started down the hallway, the boomerang finally returned, piercing Midoriya straight in his heart and waking him from the inactivity. Wait, Shouto, please, he cried out. I don't understand it either, but I want to help you. Todoroki stopped dead in his tracks, but he didn't turn around. He simply stood there, waiting. I don't know what you're experiencing. He swallowed, trying to stop the quivering of his lip and the beads of sweat that were trailing down his face. But I care about you. I want to help you. He took a breath to compose his thoughts. He wanted to make sure he said exactly what he meant, because Todoroki was waiting on him. He knew that feeling, knowing exactly what he needed to hear but being unable to ask, and right now he needed Todoroki to know that he wasn't going anywhere. I'm only able to function as well as I do, even when my best is just at par with what's supposed to be normal, because other people cared enough to help me. Midoriya looked out of the corner of his eye, but he didn't need to check to know that Gami was still there, right beside him as he always was. With every act of kindness I was blessed with, I promised to become the person that I needed at my lowest, for those that I care about. He thought about Gami. I'm always here if you need me. He thought about Ishihara. I meant what I said when we first met. Quirk or not, you're going to be a great hero one day, Midoriya. He thought about Aizawa. I know you'll be a great hero someday. You've got the heart for it, after all. He thought about Yamada. Anyone who would think that that's weird is insane. Your analysis is really helpful. Just makes me want to say yeah. He thought about Recovery Girl. Just take care of yourself, dearie. There's a lot of people who really care about you. He thought about Nezu. It was a pleasure playing against you, Midoriya. Hope we can do it again in the future. He thought about Kiori. I'm sorry for everything that Ryodai and I have done. I don't expect you to ever forgive us, but I swear that we'll change. It's how I'll repay all the people who cared enough to help me. He took a confident step forward, cradling his hands against his chest. Still, his eyes remained downcast, but now the fear and hesitancy from before evaporated amidst the fire in his heart. So don't expect me to give up that easily. You're my friend, Shouto. You're someone that I care about. He was rushed with the memories of a past long gone and a present still moving. He'd nearly forgotten how much of a train wreck that he used to be, skittish, paranoid, and resentful. In fact, it didn't seem as long as it really had been since those days, since before he got the help that he needed from people that truly cared about him. It reminded him of how incredibly lucky he was to have the support he did. If he could do anything in return, it would be to extend all of that he'd been given, and giving it forward. I'm not going to give up on you. When things get rough, I promise. He looked up, only to meet the eyes of his friend, who'd turned his head to see him, to lock in on the true emotions behind those words. And unlike before, the dead look in his eyes, it didn't scare him off. In fact, it awoke the determination and compassion of his younger, more innocent self, who he'd locked away in the face of cruel and a ruthless world out for his blood. He looked deep into Todoroki's eyes, before offering up a soft and warm smile. "You may not right now, but whenever you need me, I'm always here." There was a break in the emptiness, and Midoriya grew a bit hopeful, but it was only for a second, and then that lifeless sheen had returned. Todoroki turned back around, and with his hands in his pockets he casually walked off, disappearing down another corridor, leaving Midoriya with a hitch in his throat. But that was okay. It was going to take more than just one conversation to break through that cold shell that had frozen him over. Midoriya knew his progress wasn't instantaneous either, and that's why he would make sure that he would be there every step of the way, just as others had for him. He would make sure that Todoroki never felt alone. He turned back around, meeting his mentor with an awkward expression. Well, that was certainly something. But Kami didn't respond, seemingly staring out into the void. Midoriya's blood pressure started up again. He'd have to start taking medication at this rate. "What's wrong?" The ghost shifted, trying to put the pieces that he had together, before he froze suddenly. "It is just like Bakugo." "What?" That didn't make any sense. "What are you talking about?" "You were so insistent the day of the battle training exercise that Bakugo's hostility was out of character. I was far too angry at him to consider an excuse at the time, but the more I thought about it, the more things failed to add up." Kami paced back and forth, growing more unsettled as his thoughts started to make sense. Bakugo's overwhelming bloodlust, his violent tunnel vision, his complete and utter disregard for his own career and heroism, none of that felt true to his typical behavior. Blatantly attacking after the exercise ended with the intent to kill that would have ended any career as a hero, and he would have known that. None of it makes any sense unless he was experiencing the same thing as Todoroki is now. The teen scrambled to catch up to his mentor's racing thoughts as he too began to realize the validity of the theory. His focus was on me that day, not on Uraraka or Ida. He wanted to hurt me. Just as Todoroki admitted to now, Kami finished with dread. It is the same sudden, uncontrollable urge of violence, all directed towards you. Midoriya's heart lodged in his throat. "Oh my God. God, so it's my fault." "We do not know what it is yet." He was quick to stop his successor from drowning in guilt before they even knew what was going on. "Something is very, very wrong, but until we know the exact reason, we must remain calm. If we panic now, then we learn nothing and help no one." He struggled to calm his ragged breaths. How far did this go? He knew he shouldn't be drawing conclusions with such limited data, but it was too emotionally difficult not to. He was racking his brain for any other occasions or any other odd occurrences that suddenly made sense with this newfound context. What about Kiori? He said his brother's actions that day of Ishihara's death, they were out of character. Midori exclaimed before the memories of that day sorrowed him. I mean, going from petty thievery to a full-out cop chase that ended in multiple destroyed buildings and a death, it sounds like a sudden lack of rationality and uncontrollable urge of violence. But that was not directed towards you. Not directly, but it still impacted me personally, he interrupted. The common link is me. Oh God, what if it really is my fault? Kami slapped his hands roughly on the other's shoulders. He was starting to think that maybe he should have just kept all of this theory work in his head until he had more proof, because he should have expected Midori to immediately blame himself. But the coincidences, if they were that, were certainly uncanny, and he was starting to believe that they were more than just a coincidence. We cannot come to conclusions now, not without more evidence that angles to support this. So what? We just sit back and wait for this to happen again? We need to do something. What do you propose that we do, then? We have no information. He kept justifying his harshness as tough love, because otherwise it made him nauseatingly sick to speak to Midori like this. Right now, if this is really something abnormal, we need to focus on helping Todoroki however we can. If something in the future happens that resembles this same nature, we evaluate it. Use it to learn patterns and then hopefully stop incidents before they happen. But worrying yourself into this level of guilt, it will not help Todoroki or anyone else. His erraticness steadied, gripping tightly onto the bony hands on his shoulder, and he was grounding, a huge relief to the specter. You're right. This isn't going to help. Panicking isn't going to help. The contact remained. Kami stretched over to peer at the clock on the wall. You need to go eat. There's not a lot of time left. The teen opened his mouth. And before you try to say that food is the least of your concerns currently, may I remind you what is happening in 20 minutes? You have a festival to finish that can possibly determine the next path in your career. And I can assure you, skipping it to worry about something that we currently have nothing more than theories on to explain will not be ultimately beneficial. I was going to say I wasn't hungry anymore after this, he admitted sheepishly. But you're right, as always. I can't expect myself to think straight on an empty stomach. I always am, he teased snarkily before placing a hand on the boy's back. But I promise we will figure this out together. Hopefully it adds up to nothing more than a sick coincidence. He nodded in agreement. One could only hope, and that's all he did as they left the hallway. Together, out of the same end that Todoroki did and toward the cafeteria. Too whirlwinded by the sadistic state of their ever-changing world, neither did notice a certain eavesdropping blonde that was hiding around the other end. All right, everyone, this concludes Chapter 32 of Deku and Death. Chapter 33 will be next. I hope you guys are still enjoying this one. And as always, thank you all so much for listening.